Wonderful lunch and tours, and I hope you got to connect with other people that are here at the conference, because I wanted to mention that, like Peter said this morning, be sure to talk to people or just exchange a business card with people that you have not met. And this session, when we were planning this, we knew the first day many people will have traveled, will be a little tired. We had some exercise. And so for this last session, we wanted to do something a little bit different. And so we describe this more as a discussion. And it's meant to engage with you and you with each other to create dialogue and conversation. So this morning we had Stephen's keynote on the commons, or that was one of the key themes, and we had Creative Commons discussed as far as how libraries and researchers can use Creative Commons. Also, I should say Stephen is, can I say, an expert in copyright, or at least knowledgeable. And so this is a great opportunity if you have questions about policies or things that IFLA does on behalf of libraries. Like Stephen mentioned the Marrakesh Treaty, and actually maybe I'd like to just start there, Stephen, because you were involved in, I thought you went to the UN and you had actually been involved in some of the lead up to, or at least the advocacy for the Marrakesh Treaty, at least communicating that. You were the one that brought that information back, I know, to our committee and said, hey, this is an opportunity for libraries. Can you tell a little bit about how the role IFLA played in that?
Yes, so I being clear about what I can say I was involved in or not, I started IFLA post-Marrakesh, and so it is definitely, it's the work of colleagues that really contributed to delivering on the Marrakesh Treaty and to securing agreement back in 2013 on that as a legal instrument. And that was a really good example of libraries working with educators, with researchers, and of course, most importantly, the blind community, the community of people with print disabilities, in order to make clear that it was just, there was a really bad market failure going on. This was a really egregious example of how copyright was not working, and it was an example of how the failure to act at the international level was causing a problem. And it was one where it was an international problem, and so it required international action to resolve. Certainly where I've been involved in since then is making sure that as libraries, we're aware of what the treaty is, we're aware of the opportunity that it represents, because for each of our governments, they have been told, most of them have signed up in one way or another to this treaty. They certainly didn't oppose it, because otherwise it wouldn't have been passed. And that this should be a stimulus for governments to reform their copyright laws, to introduce an explicit exception or similar, allowing libraries and allowing people with print disabilities to create accessible format copies and share them on. But it's a stimulus. It's not one that governments necessarily need to take. There's plenty of things that governments should do that they don't do, stating the obvious. There are also, copyright is not everything, and understandably for many governments there are many things that seem more pressing, or certainly which are more likely to win votes in elections than tweaking copyright law. And so it is up to us, and it's somewhere where we can really work with the community of people with disabilities in order to push for change, and to be honest, to try and encourage people to be a little bit more ambitious. We don't just have to have exceptions for people with print disabilities. I don't know, why are we not thinking about exceptions to allow for subtitling to be clearly acceptable for people who can't hear? why aren't we allowing for other exceptions that allow people with other types of disabilities in order to be able to access works properly? This is entirely possible under the treaty. It's not obligatory, but if we get the arguments right and if we work together with the community, then there's something that we can actually achieve. Clearly, obviously, the other side of it is the practical side, and this is obviously where I think the people gathered here today, the library community, I don't know, Marrakesh, any law creates opportunities, but so much depends on whether we actually seize them.
Well, I've worked in several libraries, and one of the libraries had a staff designated to students with print disabilities and would do digitization for them. But I've also seen libraries where the resource sharing office, because you have the tools to pull material, to digitize it, to deliver it electronically to users. Usually your library has that capacity within your resource sharing operation. And so it's an opportunity for the resource sharing department to step up and leverage this. So if you don't see your library already taking advantage of this to serve all your community of users, and another thing is a lot of us use a web form for accepting requests where people can push requests into your resource sharing system. Consider how you can make those a venue or an avenue for students to say, I need this accessible, I need this maybe OCR'd, I need some service, and then your library, your operation may be able to do it, or you may have the option of connecting them with other services that are available on campus or in the library.
I was going to say that there's a really interesting, powerful point in there that one of the drivers, one of the triggers of the Marrakesh Treaty was the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities back in 2006, I think, maybe 2007, I can't quite remember. But a key theme in there was that it shouldn't be necessary for people with disabilities to go to a separate institution in order to meet their needs. They shouldn't need to go to the library for the blind. They should be able to go to a normal library, or normal, inverted commas, a standard, regular, standard issue library. And actually, because otherwise you risk creating difference, that one person goes there and everyone else goes there. And so actually mobilizing these skills and repurposing the skills and the structures that exist help meet that sort of specific aspect of the convention, that people should be able to reach the same services through the same venues rather than having to go to their own separate address.
Now, I'm curious if any of you have questions from today or things that you brought with you. Like, what are you looking to learn this week here? And we have some microphones that are coming down. What are you, over here we have someone, yeah, and there. What are you interested in learning? What have you learned already? What sparked your interest? So, yeah, we have Claudia here in the front. We'd posed if you have any questions, things on your mind, things you would like to learn this week. We'd love to hear, or thoughts from takeaways from this morning that, or things that might have resonated with you. We'd really love to hear from anyone in the audience, or we can start more discussion as well. But I'll pause a moment. Someone said they when they ask a question, they listen for the theme song of like a TV game show to give people long enough to feel uncomfortable. Obviously, I'm not shutting up, so not doing that. But not seeing any hands, I would like to think about some more work that that we might be able to do to, what I'm thinking about is, as libraries are what is the next step? Are there things beyond Marrakesh that you're working on or thinking about or trying to gain traction for, Stephen?
So, yes. I think in the vein of Marrakesh, what's interesting with Marrakesh, and there are people who will react violently and negatively to what I'm about to say. Marrakesh is proof that you can act at the international level in order to make clear that the sorts of activities that libraries carry out under copyright exceptions and limitations should be universal. And it's particularly interesting because Marrakesh gives a specific status to libraries. And in the treaty itself, it talks about authorized entities, but it's pretty well left up to governments to decide who they are, but libraries are a very clear, obvious example. And so, I don't know, we don't talk about this very much, but it is an example, a precedent in international law for saying that libraries should be able to do things. Libraries should have possibilities to do things without the fear of being sued, without the requirement to jump through any number of administrative hurdles, without the requirement to pay supplementary remuneration over and above what they've already paid in order to access a work in the first place. And what we're interested in at the moment at Wyber, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, is can we actually, so we have this one example of specific institutions, libraries, being able to reproduce for a certain purpose, giving access for people with disabilities. But there are other activities mentioned earlier, such as preservation. Now, we know that with climate change, there are not going to be fewer fires, there are not going to be fewer floods, there are not going to be fewer disasters, sadly. I don't know, this isn't going away. There will probably be fewer countries because they will go underwater. And we do face the issue that a chunk of humanity, a chunk of our heritage, which we are learning to recognize more and more as being heritage, is at risk of being lost. And so one step that we would like WIPO to take and would like WIPO to consider is saying that, well, preservation and access to preserved content is another one of these areas where there is a clear global interest. I know we all lose out when Tuvalu disappears, to be a little bit facetious, but this is part of humanity. They're human beings, they have something to contribute, they do contribute. And so it is in all of our interest to preserve this heritage, to have this possibility. It's also something, as said before, the equipment, the skills, the hardware is not held in every community, even within Europe as a pretty rich region of the world. It's perfectly normal, for example, among the Baltic states, that you actually have networks working on preservation. You have one library with the kit, and then you work across borders, because that just makes so much more sense than everyone having their own set of digitization equipment. But to be able to do this without concern that you're creating liabilities for someone else, it's important to have it clear that firstly every country should have a clear preservation exception that's technologically neutral, and that it should be possible to do things across borders. Now, the answer we'll often get back is that, well, it's a national concern, I don't know, governments decide what's best for their people and governments decide what's helpful. Two issues with that is that, firstly, it seems like a hard argument for me to say that preservation is not a universally important thing. And so if it's a universally important thing, surely we should recognize it universally. It is also the fact that in many countries, there simply isn't the capacity. I know the Copyright Office is 1.5 people, and they haven't received training for years, and no one's actually helping them at all. Again, I don't know, sometimes we look at government and we think it's this big, highly resourced thing, but a lot of the time government it's 2 or 3 people trying to do a lot of work in very little time. And so actually we shouldn't underestimate the stimulus, the push, the impetus that an organization like WIPO or any UN agency can actually provide to help governments realize, well, this is a priority, this is worth doing. So we'd certainly hope that a future step is around preservation and access to preserved content, because there's no point preserving stuff if then you have to wait until the author's been dead for 50 or 70 years before you can actually do anything with it. And as some rights holders will request. Clearly there are other areas as well. I think we would argue that research, again, it's hard to argue that research is not a universally important thing. The Article 27A of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is pretty clear that there's a right to benefit from the fruits of science, to participate in scientific progress. There's a right to participate in the cultural life of the community. These are not discretionary things that happen at the national level. They are global human rights. And so it would make sense that they are also recognized and that it's possible for libraries to legally work together across borders, partly simply because it's what people are doing already, completely unaware of the risks. So it's kind of good to be able to do something that's normal without the fear of being sued.
How can I be involved? So it's one thing to, and it's great that IFLA is working on behalf of libraries, but how do individuals or libraries themselves sort of contribute?
So I guess there's two ways, and this is really getting on to the advocacy side of my job. The first is war stories. Stories of failure and frustration. Because actually being able to demonstrate that something isn't working it's quite powerful. I don't know, a lot of the time, I don't think I've said this so far, I think I've said it in one or two conversations. Copyright as a theme is more about philosophy and psychology than it's about economics. If copyright was only about economics, it would last for 5 years. Because after 5 years, it just doesn't make sense anymore. The net loss, you start to sort of rack up losses and you start to rack up opportunity costs that actually mean that society is losing out. The peak benefit of copyright is normally about 5 years, and if you're being generous, 25 years after creation. So let's be honest, copyright is not about economics, it's about philosophy, it's about psychology, it's about the sense of owning something and having control over it, probably for as long as your grandchildren will live, if not more. So being able to come in there and actually say that, tell those human stories about what the implications are of copyright not working is powerful. And I think in particular in the case of document supply, this is an area which I think is underappreciated by policymakers. They don't really understand what it is. They probably benefited from it when they were still studying, if they studied. It's underappreciated, and I think it is a really potentially interesting area to look at. So war stories, things where copyright has prevented you from doing something that just looked like common sense. And the second, obviously a lot depends on your status and your ability to advocate and so on, but don't underestimate the capacity of governments to want to not do anything. And hey, I'm looking at you, America. It's such a nightmare to get anything through Congress.
Yeah.
Congress is horrible. And so if the government can avoid having to put something through Congress, or if the European Parliament can avoid putting something through Strasbourg and Brussels, or pick your country and pick your legislature, they will want to avoid it. And so we also need to create the sense that there is a sufficient cost to inaction to mean that they should actually do something, and they can't just batter some way and say, oh, it's the librarians, no one cares. So war stories, but also to the extent that you're able, making sure that you are using the routes available, writing to your congressman, your senator, your MP, or your MEP, or again, pick your national system, and saying, look, this is an issue.
Right.
You shouldn't ignore it.
Question in the front row. We've got a mic on the way.
Thank you so much. This is a great conversation, and I was thinking about content creators and authors, and I think, for instance, I think of the author Neil Gaiman, and what a powerful ally of libraries he is. He's one of the few authors that I know of who ever has sung the praises of interlibrary loan, which is amazing. If you've never seen his quote about the magic of interlibrary loan when he was growing up in the UK, it's an amazing thing to read. So how do we enlist authors and content creators in this? Because I feel like there's, talking to Stephen about this earlier in the day, I think they are so susceptible to publishers conjuring up these nightmare scenarios of what happens if you let these copyright exceptions into play. When I feel like if we could just get a few more Neil Gaimans out there right. on the side, on the side of the good guys. We're the good guys, right? I think that could help tremendously as well. So how do we? Are there any? Can you think of any ways we could, or is that something that that advocates are working on as well?
I don't really know. I mean, the experience that I think of is how engaged authors are with the American Library Association, and that connection I see as a place where, at least from the American side, it's an opportunity for us to make that case to authors. Whether the ALA is actively doing that, I'm not sure, but I think it's that as I look at the landscape and sort of what I see around me, that would be the place I would want to start because of that strong connection that we're featuring authors there, and now it's an opportunity to maybe educate authors as well.
I think to follow up on that, I think it's exactly that. It's explaining what libraries are doing, making clear what it is, because I think instinctively authors do. Authors want to be read, and libraries are a great way of getting read. Authors want to be discovered, and libraries are a great way of being discovered. Authors need people who can read and they like reading, which is something that libraries do. And we don't always articulate that as an offer, as something that's given. I think a secondary issue is that we tend to, copyright tends to develop its own sort of gravity. It becomes a sort of, a sort of supernova or black hole that sort of sucks in everything else around it, and then becomes very polarized, and then almost becomes sort of separate from the entire rest of the debate about how libraries actually are helping. I think, it's an impression, and it may be horribly wrong. Half the time, I'm not sure that publishers really know what they're doing. I don't think there is a huge amount of understanding of exactly what is going on. I think there is a lot of misinformation out there. There is a tendency to predict the end of the world that would make Nostradamus blush. And there's a lot of fear about what might happen. And in fact, there's not really any examples out there of the world ending, as you've noticed around you. And so I think there's also a case for actually trying to get beyond these sort of bogeymen on the publisher side, on the author side, and trying to identify where are those evidence gaps. And I'd point to, Australia's doing some great stuff, which I can talk about because I didn't do it.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you're totally right. I think the publishers, when I discussed with them, first of all, you are right that there are 5 years, then the economical issue is gone. However, they always say they are waiting for the Nobel Prize. So maybe you can have another 3 years for those who get the Nobel Prize, which are not very many. I don't know, but you are totally right. There is not really a long economical trail.
I think I did one module of economics at university, so now I think I know everything. I don't know, in economics, and you talk about externalities, so consequences of your action that do not happen to you. And the decision not to make a book more widely available has externalities. So every time that someone isn't able to access it, is every time that someone isn't able to read it, to learn from it, to apply it, to benefit from it, that has a cost. You can't measure it very well. It's an intangible cost, but no, libraries are all about intangibles. The social value of libraries is immense. It's quite difficult to put a money figure on it. These are benefits or costs that play out over the long term, but these are things that aren't internalized and at first. And so, I don't know, the cost of waiting for the Nobel Prize, or, you know, Disney may dream of what they can do with Mickey Mouse if they manage to prolong copyright again, which I think even, they'll probably just trademark it and then they're sorted. So that's fine. Trademarks you can keep on forever. But, I don't know, that sort of benefit, and it may be magic beans, it may be something, a benefit that you dream of or that you have in your mind is potentially winning, that has to be counted against the cost of limiting access. I know the Australian work is fascinating, that it's a project called Untapped. I really recommend you go look at it, and it's such a great experiment.
Untapped?
Untapped. It's the name of dozens of beer festivals and a fascinating economics project in Australia. But what they've done is they have bought up the rights to a series of books that were no longer in print. So they weren't being sold anymore, they weren't being printed anymore. And they digitized them, turned them into ebooks, and are making them available to lend from libraries, something that isn't a given otherwise, because, you know, ebooks terrifying, and people just get the ebook from the library and they'll never buy ebooks ever again, because that's why people are still buying ebooks. And actually they're beginning to find some really interesting examples that, well, people then discover the ebook through the library and then they go and buy it because they want it. And it's just a demonstration of the economic rationale followed by the rights holders is not actually rational all of the time.
So shifting a little bit, but a topic that is adjacent or could be powerful for resource sharing, but I hear about a lot at library conferences and things, is controlled digital lending. The digitization of a physical work and then lending the digital version while you sequester or hide or keep out of circulation the print copy. And it is, some scholars argue that it is the same as lending the physical item, that it isn't a violation of copyright law to do this because they're abiding by the limitations of the physical copy to be lent one at a time. And IFLA released a statement last year in support of libraries exploring controlled digital lending. Can you contextualize and tell us a little bit about what IFLA was intending, or sort of where you think controlled digital lending is going, either yourself or from IFLA's perspective with that statement?
So I don't know, to some extent, obviously, I think the idea, the novelty of controlled digital lending, the idea that it has exploded onto the scene is, I don't know, it's slightly a construct, because libraries have been lending things digitally for far longer than that, and in many cases along similar bases. And you have one copy of something, and then you're lending it out, you're controlling it, we're using digital locks to make sure that it doesn't get out onto the open internet or is used infinitely. So the idea of digital lending that is controlled is not something that's particularly new. It's something we've been practicing for some time. I think obviously the novelty of controlled digital lending, capital C, capital D, capital L, is that idea of taking the physical book and then digitizing it and then lending it out. And I think that's attractive for a number of reasons. I think firstly, it's attractive because what we all went through, what we all experienced during the pandemic, is what people who have disabilities or live in rural areas or have mobility issues in general have been experiencing forever, that the act of physically going to the library to get a copy of the book is not an easy thing, and is potentially even a source of discrimination. And so we realized this during the pandemic, but that possibility to give digital access to a physical book makes sense. We would argue, and that's what's argued in the statement, is that we should be technologically neutral. I don't know, we should focus on, and it's one copy of the book, and as long as it's one copy, it shouldn't really matter what what format that's in. I think there's an interesting argument that we don't make so much in the statement, that at the moment, physical books and ebooks are two separate markets, and they're treated as two separate markets. And so sometimes for electronic books, you have absurd markups. I don't know, the electronic book will cost many, many times more than the physical book for no particular obvious reason, and it may just be because rights holders don't know what they're doing or they spot a quick profit, but I don't know, let's assume they just don't know what they're doing. Controlled digital lending feels like a way in which you can create a backstop. So if there's no desire from the right holder, or no ability even, and this comes back to the Marrakesh point, to produce an electronic version of the book, which is more accessible for people with disabilities, for people who are living at distance, for people who have mobility challenges, for so many others, then it's a way of avoiding having that weird disparity in the market. There's an interesting sort of tension point in here, that the version of controlled digital lending that is promoted by Hansen and Wu back from 2018, there's quite a strong focus on this being about books that are not actually in commerce. They're not being sold at the moment. And so, I don't know, it's an additional argument about, you know, there's complaints about how it's the end of the world and how it's undermining sales, but well, if it's focused on books that are not being sold, it's quite difficult to claim that it's undermining sales in the first place. There's an alternative case that we're starting to look at a little bit within Europe, that, well, maybe you could look at books that are in commerce, but then you need to think about public lending right. Because in countries that do, which is most of Europe, there's a directive, there's about 32 countries worldwide have a form of public lending right, a payment. I think would hesitate to call it compensation, because we'd argue that lending books doesn't cost sales, but it's a payment that goes to the author, or sometimes the author and right holder. In that case, or maybe if we're thinking about having a public lending right attached, then that's interesting. At the same time, arguably, there's plenty of countries in the world where it's not as if libraries have acquisition budgets, and so if the library can't actually buy anything, a public lending right feels like less of a priority, when actually it would be better just to get libraries buying books and paying money to the authors for having bought the book, rather than having to pay compensation.
I love that point about putting sort of the control back in the hands of the library, both to avoid potential instances where there's markup for the digital copy, but also libraries have been preserving knowledge for millennia, and the real scary thing with ebook licensing is the intangibility, the way it can be ephemeral, it can disappear. You can subscribe to a package of ebooks, and one day the book is there, and the next day it's gone. And so I think that's the really powerful thing of libraries, being able to be the preserver of knowledge, though it does make me think of Andy's presentation this morning, and were we all buying the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of books that we license digitally, if we were buying those and sticking them in a storage facility, we would all need to be appealing for however many £1 million that was to store.
So that's entirely true, and I think the crucial point here is backstop. That this isn't a call for the end of licensing. It would be absurd to call for licensing. What it is a call for there to be a means of making sure that the publishers can't just walk away from the table. And so that, I don't know, if the worst comes to the worst, if there's no deal, then the library does have a backstop to do what it needs to do.
It's not free either.
Oh no, none of this
Like
is
to
free.
digitize
Yeah.
and store.
Well, exactly. It's the point made with sort of smaller countries around the world. No, it is definitely not free, but the idea is just you have a backstop to make sure that then you're getting licenses that are better than the backstop, rather than worse. That's the most absurd thing, is when you're getting something under a license under worse terms than you would under the law because it's a license.
So we are approaching the top of the hour, and if Ibrahim has a question. Yeah, I was going to see if there were any final questions or thoughts on the day.
Good morning, good evening, actually. So it's not a question, but I have learned from our electronic resources librarians that some publishers are, for example, taking chunks of collections that we already have a license to, a perpetual access license, and then they are creating another collection and putting it in the market for people to buy. So they take part of other collections and they create a new collection. So I was wondering how ethical is this? Like, you have both a collection and you have perpetual access to it, and then they are taking a part of this collection that you already get to create another collection to sell it to you. So from the copyright or from the ethical point of view, how do you explain this?
Just to clarify, when you say they're taking part of the collection, they're removing it from the package you've subscribed to, or they're just reselling it for more money?
No, not removing it. They are just duplicating it in another collection.
I suppose they're businesses, they have to make money. And as long as they're not, I don't know, there's nothing, I don't know, money itself is not dirty. And if they want to do that, obviously then you have to follow consumer law. You shouldn't be mis-selling, you shouldn't be misleading the customer, you shouldn't be sort of giving the impression to the library. You should not be in a situation where you are covering the library's eyes and giving the impression they have to buy that package in order to get access again. And if publishers want to sell something that isn't very valuable, that's fine. And we also have to be obviously responsible consumers in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the acquisition, or it makes me think of the acquisition librarian. Historically, or back when I think about when I started in libraries in the early to mid 90s, like they would get catalogs and they'd go through and they'd select books and they'd search to see who had it, and it was a very labor intensive process. And we need to make sure we don't get lazy, because these electronic packages, sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around how do you evaluate 100,000 or so titles. And but it may come back to our libraries being diligent and calling out. And I do like the presentation this morning that talked about sharing your experience and how the Qatar Foundation and Library is posting, what they're paying for open access and things like that, and the licensing to expose to everyone so we can support each other.
Now, I think to follow up on that, this is a field where it feels that having more consumer or competition antitrust expertise would be helpful. Certainly the practice of bundling in the academic field is very troubling. Bundling in ebooks is troubling as well. You're giving the impression you need to buy a whole load of stuff in order to access one thing, and the price of individual ebooks is ramped up to push you towards the bundle. Bundles are deeply uncompetitive because then you push out the smaller providers who aren't in the bundle. So I don't know, there's a big antitrust competition thing. I don't know, the more we can do to actually get governments seeing that this is something worth looking at for a market investigation, the better, because there's quite a lot that feels like it shouldn't be right. And I don't know, electricity companies can do it, phone companies get investigated, Microsoft got investigated for bundling things,
Right.
but that's because they're a billion dollar company.
So, any final thoughts or takeaways you want to talk about? Okay, well, thank you all. It's been a wonderful day, and I think Katya is going to come and just give us a few words before we wrap up.